Hello, I am Stephen Bloom, Assistant Vice President for Government Relations here at the American Council on Education, ACE. I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's webinar, which is entitled Climate Justice in Transition, Centering Equitable Solutions in a Shifting Policy Landscape. We have a wide and diverse panel of campus experts for this discussion today. I know they're going to be terrific, and we're so pleased to have them, and we're pleased to have you. We have also been very happy to partner with Second Nature on this webinar series titled Charting Opportunities and Challenges in Higher Education's Climate Action Journey. Today is the last of our multi-part series. Recordings of each of the prior webinars in this series are available on both ACE and Second Nature's websites. We can certainly make that available to you if anyone is interested. Now, let me turn it over to Theo Daniels, the Chief Policy Manager at Second Nature, who will lead our discussion today.
Thank you for the introduction, Stephen. Hi, everyone. For those of you who have not had the chance to meet, I am Theo Daniels, Climate Policy Manager here at Second Nature and the moderator of our webinar today. And we are gathering at a moment when the climate policy landscape is changing quickly. Institutions are continuing to pursue emissions reductions, resilience planning, clean energy transitions, and sustainability commitments, but they are doing so amid political uncertainty, shifting federal and state priorities, and uneven access to resources. Today's conversation will bring together leaders working across different institutional, geographic, and community contexts. We will explore what climate justice looks like in practice, how institutions can sustain their commitments during periods of transition, and what it means to center equitable solutions when the policy environment is unstable. And so thank you all for being here. As we work our way through the session, please feel free to say hello and shout out where you're joining us from in the chat. You can also ask questions that we will have the opportunity to address during our open-ended Q&A session after the moderated discussion. Questions can be addressed to individual panelists or to the group outright. But before we get to those, we'll spend a little over half an hour discussing key topics at the intersection of climate justice and higher education, drawing on the wide array of institutional and geographic contexts that our panelists occupy. And I'm excited to be moderating this conversation because the title of the session, I feel, really captures the moment that we are in, right? Climate justice in transition. Across higher education, institutions are still being asked to reduce emissions, prepare for climate impacts, support students and communities, and make long-term infrastructural decisions. But they're doing so in a policy landscape that is just shifting quickly and in many cases becoming much more complicated than it was before. And so today, we want to move beyond broad climate justice commitments and talk about what this work actually requires. How do institutions keep equity at the center when resources are limited? How do they stay accountable to communities disproportionately impacted by climate change? How do they prepare students to lead in a world where climate impacts are already here? And how do we make sure climate justice does not become something that is only prioritized when the policy conditions are convenient? We have a great group of panelists with us today, each bringing a different perspective on climate justice, higher education, sustainability, student belonging, and community-centered work. So I'll briefly introduce each speaker, and then I'll invite them to share a short opening reflection on their role and how they come to this work. First, we are joined by Jenny Stevens, Professor of Climate Justice at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth. Jenny's work focuses on climate justice, energy democracy, and the social dimension of climate transition. Jenny is also the author of Climate Justice in the University, Shaping a Hopeful Future for All, which was featured in the Yale Climate Connections list of 12 books to help you create a just and sustainable future. We also have Luis Fernandez, Academic Manager of Sustainability at Tecnológico de Monterrey, who brings experience working at the intersection of sustainability education, institutional strategy, and climate action in an international higher education context. Joining us as well is Olivia Aguilar, Director of the Miller Worley Center for the Environment at Mount Holyoke College. Olivia's work connects environmental education, justice, student leadership, and institutional sustainability. We are also joined by Mac Portasano, Director of Multicultural Services, Student Wellbeing, Engagement, and Belonging at Portland Community College. Mac brings an important perspective on student-centered equity, belonging, and how climate justice connects to broader institutional support systems. And finally, we have Ken Opperman-Torres, a private consultant and former Director of Sustainability at Dillard University. Ken brings experience from the HBCU sustainability space and from work focused on institutional capacity, environmental justice, and community-grounded climate action. And thank you all for joining us today. And so to start, I'd like to ask each of you to briefly introduce yourself and your work and keep the following question in mind. What does climate justice mean in your current work and what feels most urgent about this moment? So we'll start with you, Jenny.
Great. Thank you so much, Theo and Second Nature and ACE for hosting us and bringing us together. Um, I was in the United States for much of my life and career, but I moved back to Ireland, where I'm from, 2 years ago. And part of the move was related to my work because I felt increasingly um, kind of, it's got more difficult to do my work in the United States. So I'm just going to mention very quickly this book that I wrote that came out in 2024 called Climate Justice in the University, in which I kind of acknowledged how powerful higher education institutions are, why they are attacked in authoritarian regimes and to try to stifle democratic processes, and how they're kind of connected with concentrating wealth and power and or distributing wealth and power. So what I do in this book, which is an open access book, is try to reimagine what a climate justice university could be, like what it would be if we were actually focused, if the whole purpose of higher ed was to shape hopeful, positive, healthy, stable futures for all. And I just want to acknowledge the time we're in that it's a very disruptive time, but with disruption is the time for transformation. And I think that's what climate justice means to me. It's not just about trying to make small changes here and there, which many of us have been trying for a long time in our universities. It's actually about having a transformative lens that if things are falling apart, systems and structures aren't working, it's actually a disruptive time, and it's a time for us to be really reimagining things and opening up what's possible when we rebuild and reconstitute kind of where things are and where we want to be. So this can connect both with teaching, research, also the financial flows of universities, like how we're supported and who's funding the university, who has control over what spaces are allowed to endeavor and where inquiry goes, but also relationships and power and connection with community and people. Um, and so, yeah, and the final thing I just want to say is I want to introduce to everyone this new initiative, Climate Justice Universities Union, which is an international collective trying to reimagine and transform the potential of higher education for the just transition and advance climate justice. So all of you are welcome to join this. It's an international endeavor. We have webinars and resources on how to resist AI in higher ed, how to reclaim higher education institutions for the public good and for climate justice, and then bigger picture conversations about restructuring society, economic systems, and all of that. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Luis?
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here with you today. Thank you to the American Council on Education and Second Nature for inviting me. I'm Luis Fernandez from Tecnológico de Monterrey in Mexico, the largest private university in Mexico, where I serve as academic manager of sustainability. Through our institutional sustainability strategy, we work to embed sustainability into education, research, decision-making, and institutional culture, not simply as an environmental agenda, but as a way of shaping how future professionals understand responsibility and respond to complex societal challenges. I also serve as lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 2, having contributed to both the sixth and now the seventh assessment reports. Across these different roles, I've become increasingly interested in one question: how do we move beyond seeing climate justice simply as the fair distribution of impacts and benefits, and instead examine the systems of power, governance, and decision-making that produce those inequalities in the first place? That's a little bit of the perspective that I'll bring to today's conversation. So in my work as academic manager of sustainability and also as IPCC author, I think in both climate change is fundamentally about making visible and addressing differentiated experiences of climate change and climate responses, while also examining the systems and structures that produce those differences. I think for years we asked how climate change affects people or how to make just transitions. Increasingly, the question is how climate change disrupts people, institutions, ecosystems, and societies. So justice, therefore, can not only be about distributing impacts fairly, it must also address who is most exposed to disruption, why are they exposed, and who has the capacity to shape these responses. And I think even more importantly, what are the structures that create and perpetuate injustice to make power dynamics visible? So what feels more urgent in my work, I would say, and in the world, is preventing climate justice from being reduced to a checklist of equity indicators while losing sight of the structural conditions that create vulnerability in the first place. More importantly, what is urgent is to change the misconception of climate justice as something nice to have, as the cherry on top of a pie. And most importantly, that equity and justice are not only topics, but analytical lenses with which we judge the world and act accordingly. With this, providing people with not only a training session on the topics, but of the analytical frameworks of what ethics really is, seems really urgent. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that insight. Let's go to Mac.
Thanks, Theo, and thanks, Jenny and Luis, for bring. I'm ready to go. I was on vacation. I came back just to be on this panel, and if this is what we're going to engage in, I'm for it. My name, Talo Falava, everyone. My name is Make Russo Protsano. Folks can call me Mac. Use he and pronouns. I'm the director for multicultural services at Portland Community College. I'm also a member of the Council of Elders for the Pacific Climate Warrior Team, 350 Pacific. In terms of, what this work means to me, and really, I think maybe my role, not having what I guess people would call a traditional sustainability role on campus, being from like the student affairs side, was really based on my experience engaging in climate justice work in the Pacific. Everybody has to be involved to make this thing work. Not just the sustainability offices, not just the environmental justice faculty members, from the top to the bottom and everything in between, especially our students. We're finding that this is a key way forward to really engage in this work. And so for me, especially I live in Portland, Oregon right now, our climate environment doesn't reflect the communities who are most affected. A lot of what we're seeing on the environmental justice side are Black and Brown and Indigenous communities being placed in places where there's low air quality, high cancer risk, and a lack of resources. For me as a Pacific Islander, often what we're seeing is people speaking on our behalf, telling our story and not really telling it from our perspective. One of our key campaigns and our motto for the Pacific Climate Warriors is "We are not drowning, we are fighting." I think the painted picture of the Pacific is that we are dependent on other nations, and we are not seen in the news clippings, in the media, as those who are holding the front line on international policy. And so there's really reframing of moving from someone else's perspective, but for us to bring our ocean into language and into what's happening in higher ed. And so I really work hard, and our institution has done a great job in our climate action plan, making sure there's language there and policy to match our desires and practice to get communities who are most affected. So me being a director for multicultural services and being in the sustainability work is one of the key components to me that our policies are working. We put it on paper and now we have to fulfill it in practice. And so that's a lot of what I'm going to share in this space, but I'm happy and I'm excited to hear what everyone else says, and especially because a good friend of mine is going next. Haven't seen you in a minute, sis, so I'm gonna pass it on your way.
Go ahead, Kim.
Hi, I'm Kim Upperman Torres. I'm down in New Orleans, Louisiana, and I was formerly the Director of Sustainability at Dillard, and I'm doing some private consulting. What climate justice means to me right now, from where I'm sitting in the state that I'm in, is helping people find a way to continue the work, even if maybe they have to change their language. So in preparation for this presentation, what I did is I interviewed 7 colleagues from about 5 different states. So I talked to people in public, private, R1s, liberal arts, HBCUs, community colleges, and in red and blue states to find out how current environment is affecting what's going on with them. And there's definitely a chilling effect. And I do want to state that whether someone's in a red or a blue state, I found that everyone is dealing with different sorts of issues. So I think it's important for us to talk about that and then talk about solutions or workarounds that people are currently doing and how they're dealing with those challenges that they're facing. So I'm sort of the voice of a handful of people that I interviewed with, some who definitely would not feel comfortable speaking, and this in space, but giving a chance for what they're experiencing and how they're working around it to kind of come to everyone to hopefully to support others who might be in similar situations.
Thank you, Kim. And last but most certainly not least, we have Olivia.
Hi everyone, and I'm so sorry about my camera. It was working a second ago, so I know the team is trying to get me on, but I think we'll just use my photo in the meantime. My name's Olivia Aguilar. I use she/her pronouns. I'm the director of the Miller Worley Center for the Environment at Mount Holyoke College and a professor of environmental studies. We're located in the western part of Massachusetts in the U.S. And Mount Holyoke, I think that the context is important, and I'll explain sort of why here. But we are a private small liberal arts college and a women's college that is gender diverse. And as our president reminds us, we were forged in dissent. In fact, a prominent site on our webpage reminds readers that higher education is under fire and Mount Holyoke is meeting the moment. For nearly 200 years, we've championed educational inclusion for women and people marginalized on the basis of gender. Today, we remain a powerful force for changemakers and visionaries who refuse to accept the status quo. And it goes on to read that we are a launch pad for fearless leaders, and that we are challenging injustice and driving change. And so I say all of that just to sort of explain the context I'm working in at the moment, which feels unique, I think, given what we're hearing from a lot of people, around, as Kim was just talking about, the people that she has been talking with. I recognize this, and I suddenly am finding myself in a position that seems a little bit of privilege, which is very out of the norm for me and my work. But I feel that we have support from college administrators as well as support from major donors and alums who really believe deeply in what we are trying to do, which has allowed us to continue to make progress in increments on some of the initiatives that we've tried to undertake. So we have quite a few climate justice initiatives at the college. I might try to see if I can share my screen still. Maybe I can do this, even if you can't see me. You might be able to see. Can you see a slide? Yes, maybe. Okay, great. Okay, so some of our initiatives right now, we host a summit on feminist leadership and climate justice every other year. We have started a community commitment to climate justice, and really that's taken inspiration from, I've heard Mac speak a couple of times, and really been inspired by the work that he's doing. We've also begun our Sustainability Action Justice for the Environment plan, which goes beyond our decarbonization into a holistic approach at the college, and we've just kicked off a climate justice lab. So I'm happy to answer questions about the how or the what later, but I'm excited to be here, and I just want to thank the organizers of this. I think this is a really important conversation, and I'm really thrilled to be in community with the people here on the panel.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for those wonderful introductions and just for an inkling of the insight that we're going to be touching on today. And it's pretty clear that we're united, right, in our common fight to want to achieve climate justice outcomes for a lot of the communities that we serve, aspire to serve, and embed ourselves in. But I actually want to start by acknowledging our differences here on this panel, right? And I want to start with something that I believe, Jenny, you touched on first, Luis, you picked up on, and Kim, I think you really drove home to me, and Olivia, something that you mentioned as well, really everyone. And that's just that not every institution has the same capacity to pursue this climate justice work, right? And we see that also just in the difference of capacity on some of the institutions that we have in this panel right now. We have international context, we have community colleges, former interest representatives, private liberal arts colleges. There's a lot going on here. So small campuses, institutions are politically constrained sometimes in states and often face different resource realities in wealthier institutions. But capacity isn't also just only about monetary or staff considerations. It's also about the capacity to be able to influence change. I think like you touched on there, Luis, for a bit. So how should higher education climate sector better account for some of these differences? What does that look like for each of you in your role specifically, maybe?
Sorry, do you want me to go first, or I don't know what the order is.
We can go in any order now, but let's start with you then, Jenny.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think what I would say to that question is climate justice is about acknowledging power dynamics, and we all have power, right? No matter what the context, no matter what the institution, but we have to navigate it in different ways based on, and we have to, a lot of times there can be extreme oppression, right? That shuts things down, and so I think um, acting, I guess what I find is that people are uh, navigating things differently and cleverly to continue, and also in some ways, in a strange way, I guess I've found in my own context, and now I'm in Ireland, not in the United States. People are, because everything is going so badly all around the world, and we're actually in a heat wave here in Ireland. It's like a record-breaking heat today, or this whole week, and people are really ready for bigger transformative change, like that goes beyond the things that we've been trying for a long time, and realizing how inadequate and insufficient a lot of the smaller things that we've been doing are. So I think that's where you get into different conversations about bigger picture things like moving away from mainstream economic thinking of growth continuously, right? That and the billionaires getting so controlling so many things, and AI kind of being a instrument of domination and control of what information we see or we have access to. So I guess I'm just saying in my context, I'm in more and more spaces where people are more aware of the need or the opportunity for bigger transformative change, which is not something universities are good at necessarily promoting, right? Because they are very much so. So a lot of it is conversations kind of beyond the campus, I guess. Yeah.
Kim, I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about some of the expertise that you've gleaned, obviously, in your role at Dillard, but and having the opportunity to have spoken to some folks in the sector here across a myriad of states and context. How are different folks considering an unique situation and context, what the transition means right now, and how does capacity play a role in that? Are we seeing, for example, more folks being hampered by staff shortages or monetary concerns, right? Just having the well run dry? Is it a conversation of being able to convince administrators or the board of directors to say, hey, climate still deserves to be on the agenda, climate justice specifically? Or is it an issue of going to the state house and being able to advocate for changes in that avenue?
Yeah, so some of the universities that I spoke to, I'd say that capacity wise, size isn't as significant as the break between public and private. So private universities, just many of them they're talking about budget constraints, they're talking about those sorts of things, but they are still able to have language and discussions about environmental justice, sustainability, DEI. So in a special way, they're sort of in a special bubble right now from what they're telling me. The public universities, some of them have been, I mean, they've basically been scrubbing large amounts of language out of their websites, their policies, their programs, and they're attempting to continue to do the work, but they're just putting it in a different vocabulary context. So, for example, one of the universities that I spoke with no longer can have a greenhouse gas goal, but they're using greenhouse gas to track energy efficiency. So are they still tracking it? Yes, but they can't have that goal, for example. Some universities are encountering things like they are no longer allowed because of state mandates to be able to do anything with an organization that's talking about net zero. So if they're getting funding or they're attempting to participate in programming from those sorts of organizations, they're having to stop doing that. So that means they're sort of retooling who they're talking with and what they're doing. There's a lot of just stepping back from federal funding and focusing on foundations right now. Because people are like, well, with a foundation, I can ask for what I need and describe exactly the work I want to do in environmental justice, and I'm not going to get pushback. So those things, a changing of the language. People are talking about efficiency, energy efficiency. They're talking about these activities that we do help build student engagement, help build student enrollment. They're kind of shifting what their focus is to things that will appeal to the university, but will not maybe get the pushback that and that of course is in that public sector when you're in a red state. But I will say, I was fascinated to hear that people who are in blue states or they're struggling because the networks of communities of sustainability directors and communities they were working with across multiple states is shrinking. So people who they used to have great relationships with and who they were doing research with or who they were working on a grant with or who they were partnering with for outreach, it's a chilling effect, right? Those people are having to pull back, so that's challenging.
Hello. Yes.
Sorry. I had someone tell me that they've been working on a long-term study and they have pretty significant findings about climate change, but they're not talking about it and they're not publishing about it because they don't want to lose that funding. So, there's a little bit of hiding going on and using different language that I find. Sorry, that was rather long-winded.
No, it was necessary. And I'm curious. I see you raising your hand. Do you have something you wanted to add? By all means.
Thank you. So perhaps, I mean, my context is very different in Mexico, but I wanted also to make the point about smaller institutions and politically constrained contexts that I think justice should not become a privilege of wealthy institutions. I think that is my main idea that I would like to develop here. I think we should be careful not to confuse institutional commitment with institutional capacity. Institutions operate under very different financial, political, regulatory, and social realities. A small regional university or an institution operating in a politically constrained environment cannot reasonably be expected to have the same resources, influence, or opportunities as a large, well-funded institution. But justice requires recognizing those differentiated capacities rather than applying identical expectations everywhere. And at the same time, I think that limited capacity should not be confused with limited responsibility. Every institution, regardless of their size, budget, or political context, can ask difficult questions. Every institution can examine whose voices are being heard, whose knowledge is recognized, whose interests are prioritized, and what assumptions are shaping its decisions. Those questions require courage and intellectual honesty more than financial resources. So, this is particularly important in politically constrained contexts. Institutions may not always be able to transform public policy or launch ambitious climate justice initiatives, but they can still cultivate critical thinking, create spaces for dialogue, question dominant assumptions, and educate students to recognize the structural dimensions of climate injustice. So, for me, climate justice is not measured only by what institutions are able to do. It is also measured by their willingness to ask the questions that others may prefer to avoid. So capacity determines the scale of action, but commitment determines whether those questions are asked at all. Thank you.
It's great insight. Olivia.
Thank you. I fully agree, Luis, and yes, thank you for those words. I think it's helped me to frame some of the things I've been thinking about, which is that at this particular moment, I think this just offers an opportunity for us to, and I don't want to say this in a way that seems like naive or Pollyannish, but to be creative about what does transformative change look like, and to be creative about what does capacity mean to do this work. So one of the things that I have been working on since I became director was how are we building relationships on campus with our community partners and with external partners. Those partnerships now seem to be so important about our work and what our work can look like when people are feeling strained and in terms of resources and capacities. I think that right now is actually the time when all of a sudden the relationships that we have been cultivating for years are finally finally coming to a point where people are seeing that the center is a place where they can go if they need help with transportation, if they need help with, labor issues. So I think that, yes, there's always some, if we are doing climate justice work, what I tell my team is we're doing justice work. What does that mean in terms of a campus? What does it mean to be just as a center? And so there's so many areas that we can look at and support. And I fully think that even if you don't have the resources to do some big initiative, you can be working on relationship building and you can be working on supporting the other people on your campus in terms of the work that they're trying to do. So, so thank you for framing that, Luis. I think that's really important.
I want to take what you mentioned at the end there and pair that with something that Louise said. Louise, something you said that really stuck with me is limited capacity should not mean limited responsibility. I think that's very important to hold in mind, right? I think sometimes for maybe some of our small institutions, it can seem daunting when you have institutions that may be able to throw millions at these problems, or like you mentioned, announce really large commitments, and some of us just don't have that capacity. But I also want to hold that in the context of we're all playing a different ball game right now, right? And that might also really apply to yourself, Luis, and Jenny as well, outside of the United States. And so I'm curious, particularly for you two, but also for the rest of our panelists, mainly for Jenny and Luis first, how does what's happening in the US land in international context, right? This federal uncertainty and the sharp pivot away from climate action with federal backing. I'm curious how that lands for you. And separately, I'm curious to understand what can institutions learn about climate justice work or just justice work simply as Olivia shared happening outside of their own national, regional, cultural context?
Yeah, so I mean, I think people outside the United States, well, people here have a hard time understanding exactly what's going on over there and how bad it is, I guess, or how constrained and how big of a shift there it has been internally, and how universities in particular are under attack. And I think I do work on fossil fuel phase out, which a lot, there's more and more coming out, and this is actually coming up. Actually, today, Drilled Media and ProPublica just released a new resource that's quite amazing called Carbon Captured, which shows how the fossil fuel industry has captured uh, mostly very prestigious universities and climate and energy research in the United States in the 90s and 2000s to, promote fossil fuel friendly futures. And that's kind of one of the reasons why we are where we are today. So I mentioned that just to say that the power of the fossil fuel mentality, and I call it, people have written about petromasculinity. It's very masculine, controlling, dominate, not just dominate people. Not just dominate the Earth systems with drill, baby, drill, and fossil fuel extraction at all costs, but also dominating and controlling people, right? And especially more vulnerable people, and that's kind of. I think people are really shocked to see what's happening in the United States, and I know in many places think, oh, that will never happen here, but throughout the world, the same pattern is emerging in many places. So I think some of the same, and definitely some of the same influences about higher education and kind of constraining what goes on in higher education, and what doesn't go on in higher education, and kind of shutting down protests and blocking action that would be toward a transition or transformation toward a more climate just future. So I think that, obviously what's happening in the United States is having huge influence all around the world. And in the higher ed sector, I think it's hard for people outside to understand exactly what's going on inside, but it is also having ripple effects and having impact elsewhere as well. So I don't know if that was exactly gets, Theo, to what you were asking about, but that's what came to mind with that kind of question about how things in the US are impacting things outside. Yeah, I'll hand it over to you, Luis.
Thank you, Jenny. So, with what can institutions learn internationally about climate justice? I think that many institutions discuss climate justice primarily through local inequities. Those are important, of course, but climate justice is also international. The resources, emissions, technologies, supply chains, and vulnerabilities that shape climate risk often cross borders. But I think that one of the greatest opportunities is to recognize that climate justice does not look the same everywhere. Institutions have a great deal to learn by listening to how justice is understood and practiced in different political, economic, and social contexts. So I think that in much of the global north, climate justice conversations often focus on questions such as ensuring a just transition or making decision making more inclusive or about distributing the benefits and burdens of climate action more fairly. And of course, these are essential conversations. But in many parts of the global south, the conversation is often far more immediate. It is about communities living with climate impacts today. It is about defending territories and livelihoods. It is about environmental defenders being threatened or even killed. It is about institutions operating where governance may be weaker, inequalities deeper, and the risks of speaking out much greater. That difference matters because it reminds us that climate justice is not only a matter of discourse, it is also a matter of lived reality. The costs, risks, and possibilities for action are not the same everywhere. So, for example, forms of civic engagement, or as Fridays for Future or other NGOs ask for or demand that people do civil disobedience, it may be possible in one context, but it may carry very different consequences in another. I guess it's fairly easy to do civil disobedience if you're living in Sweden, but if you're doing civil disobedience in Mexico City or elsewhere in the global south, well, it carries a lot of implications to do such a thing. So I think higher education has a responsibility to avoid universalizing its own experience rather than assuming that one model of climate justice applies everywhere. Institutions should approach international collaboration with humility, reciprocity, and learning across contexts is not only simply about transferring best practices, it is about recognizing that different histories, power relations, and material realities reveal different dimensions of justice. So ultimately, what institutions can learn from one another is not only different solutions, but different questions. Those questions help us see dimensions of climate justice that might otherwise remain absolutely invisible within our own institutional or national context.
It's very important. Yes, Mac. And I saw you nodding there fervently, so I want to give you a chance to speak as well. But what you mentioned there is very correct, Luis. We can't consider higher education's experience with climate justice to be a monolith. And Mac, I was going to tie that to what you mentioned. You spoke to the direct impacts earlier, right? Especially for Black and Brown communities, and the importance of not speaking on behalf of those communities. So I wanted to invite your words now and just maybe help us form a little bit more about what meaningful community accountability can look like in times like these across the context.
Yeah, and before I answer, would like to add on to the international piece. A lot of my work is not here in the U.S., it's back home in the Pacific. And I think what I heard before is spot on in terms of what institutions here are doing and how they're monopolizing a lot of the narratives that are being put out there, really for recognition and resource grabbing that really silences a lot of the global South. Like what we hear a lot here in the U.S. and why, I go on campus tours to talk about what's happening in the Pacific. Our work is being dismissed by their relationship to international policy and what that looks like. And so fat cats in suits, people who don't care showing up to the UN. Um, and that's the perspective from the global north and industrial countries. A lot of us in the global south represent communities who have the least amount of carbon input or are most affected, if not first affected, by what the rest of the world is doing. And then the other part is being here in the US and what we're constantly trying to do, especially through our cultural centers, is that we're not in a post-colonial movement. This stuff is still happening, is real. The US has um, still left their mark and they are still occupying nations around the world and in the Pacific. And so policies that are being passed, maritime laws and, allowing the government to go into spaces like American Samoa, like Guam, um, like the Federal States of Micronesia and all these other spaces to do their deep sea mining by bypassing the laws. Like we're living in like an idea that like colonialism happened in the past and not seeing how it's still being affected today and what we're doing. It's a living thing. And I think the ignorance around that is affecting a lot of these communities and what we're able to do because those communities are showing up at the places like the UN. They are fighting for things like the fossil fuel free non-proliferation treaty. They are leading a lot of the work and to keep it in the round, international movements. And these things are all very interconnected. But we do a really good job in our institutions of separating ourselves from what's happening outside in the rest of the community. So I just also wanted to add that part to what we're doing, how that's affecting, and how the U.S. or schools are participating in a lot of that hurt.
Hmm.
I already forgot this next part of your question, though. I mean, if you want to go back to the second one.
Well, no, we can respin the wheel here. So it sounds, given the era that we are in now, speaking out on climate can cost people their jobs. It can cost institutions their funding, or can lead to much worse realities, especially for those of us outside of the U.S. And so it's clear that the language that we use around climate justice, equity, sustainability, that matters, right? And so my question to you all is now is how can institutions, individuals, professors, sustainability faculty communicate about this work in ways that are still honest and value driven without watering down the substance?
Well, what I'm hearing and seeing a lot of people talking about is that they're doing what Louise is talking about. They're doing that community view, what's close, what's personal, what's in their space. And I didn't point out earlier, but there seems to almost be a safety net for student organizations from what I was hearing, that students are doing advocacy, doing more things than maybe a director at a university might be comfortable speaking out on or talking about. And also that focus back on community. So, what are our immediate justice issues where we are? We are close to a petrochemical plant. We are in these areas. Helping, focusing directly on those communities may escape the title of climate justice. That may give them trouble, but will do the work that needs to be done. A very small university that I spoke to, they're working a lot with their students to talk about farming, making food pantries, reaching out into the community and connecting with their community in those ways. That may not seem like a very big deal, but whenever you're in a food desert, providing those things that are gonna allow the community and the students at the university to connect with the environment is very important for building those. And I'm talking about a particular place that is sort of having some restrictions placed on them. They're still, as one person I talked to say, my job is to still do the work that I was doing to help the people around me who need it, but just to make sure that I'm doing it in a different way. But also those conversations that are going on with the students, I think it's important to realize that what may be posted on a website or in policy or maybe the forward face of a university is not the conversations that the students are having. And I think it's very hopeful that the student body is still engaging and still talking. It's still important to them, even if their legislation says they can't talk about it. They're still going to talk about it. And that I've tapped into what Jenny and Louise are saying, that the higher education has a special place there for letting those conversations continue and for maybe helping that next generation be able to speak out and change what we're currently in.
I want to go Olivia, then Jenny. Thank you, Kim.
Thanks. Yes, I just want to pick up and on what Kim is saying. It's something I've been thinking about a lot, actually, in my own research. That I look at climate mobility. I am trying to do this in a state that is not, is a red state that largely doesn't recognize some of the terms I'm working with, and I'm really, and that's okay. But this is a bit of like I need to have some own humility about how I come to the work and about how I frame things. And so what I think this gives us an opportunity to do is actually hone in specifically on the work, kind of to Kim's point, in the community that we're doing. And so maybe the work is around food, maybe the work is around transportation, maybe the work is around energy. But I also remember when I first started teaching about climate like 20 years ago, that I would say to my students, climate touches everything. And so I think that this is an opportunity really to distill that and say, we don't have to use this broad umbrella. We can simply say, these are the things that we were talking about. And these are the things that's impacting and we're seeing it. And so, again, to Kim's point, students are interested. They haven't lost their interest. And so this is now our responsibility to really focus in on what this specifically means. We don't have I am not, and this is just my personal belief, that we have to use the big umbrella of climate change or climate justice. We're still doing the work, and we can be specific about how we're doing that work.
Yeah, Jenny.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that there's a lot of intimidation, fear, silencing, um, and I mean, I experienced it, and I think many colleagues and friends and are experiencing it. So I just wanted to say that out loud, that and I think for me, one of the other things is to think about the climate crisis and climate injustices not as technical problem that needs to be fixed, which is the way some of our institutions think about it in terms of carbon emissions, but as a symptom, right, of these bigger structural problems that Luis was talking about. And that actually it's not just climate, right? That is the crisis. We have polycrisis of so many things: international law, war, genocide, horrible things happening in so many dimensions, homelessness, cost of living, like people are suffering in so many ways. And I think one of the things that's hard, I think, for our institutions, and most institutions like to show a positive lens, like that they're doing lots of good stuff, and but it can be, you know, in the face of what's happening around the world, it can seem very insufficient and inadequate. And I think that's where the climate justice lens opens up space to connect things in different ways. And yeah, so I just wanted to acknowledge that. And I'm just going to put in the chat a link to the Climate Justice Universities Union, because there is a North American branch of the Climate Justice Universities Union, and it's an international collective. And one of the things that the union provides is spaces for people who to share and to come together. And sometimes, you know, a lot of things we've done that the union has done is create spaces to talk about things that people can't talk about in their universities, in their institutions, including a lot of the AI stuff that is very troubling, that's hard to address, and also precarity, right, of students and of staff. And often, you know, a lot of issues like that there aren't many, the spaces are constrained, I guess, within campuses sometimes. So I'll just post that there in case anyone's interested to learn more, and everyone's encouraged and invited to have a look and see if they're yeah, and you're welcome to contribute. We have like virtual events and working groups and branches, so there's lots of ways to get involved if people are interested in being in a kind of international collective.
Luis.
Thank you. I would like to provide another angle to this issue of communicating climate justice in contested environments, and particularly the role of language. So I think we sometimes approach this question as if it were only about finding politically acceptable language. So I would frame it a bit differently. The challenge is not simply choosing words that can survive political contestation, but it is mostly about making sure that our language does not normalize injustice. And this is what I mean. Language is never neutral. The words we choose shape what becomes visible and what feels inevitable, and ultimately what kinds of responses seem appropriate. So sometimes technical or seemingly neutral language can unintentionally obscure responsibilities or normalize conditions that should instead be questioned. So, for example, we often speak of biodiversity loss, a phrase that sounds almost natural or passive, when in many contexts we're talking about the deliberate, systematic destruction of ecosystems. We speak of water scarcity, which can suggest an unavoidable natural shortage, when in some places the problem is better understood as a consequence of political choices, unequal allocation, pollution, or what some have called now water bankruptcy. So the language we use can either illuminate or conceal the human decisions and power relationships behind those realities. So for me, this does not mean that institutions should simply replace one set of terms with more provocative ones. Rather, it means that we have a responsibility to ask what our language makes visible and what it leaves invisible. Are we describing a condition, or are we acknowledging the processes that produce it? Are we naming an impact, or are we also naming responsibility? So sometimes protecting the substance is more important than protecting the label. But let's be careful not to normalize injustice in the process. And I think it's very important when we're dealing with communication in political contested spaces.
Absolutely. A bit of housekeeping here as we head into the final 20 minutes of our session. If you all have any questions in the participants, feel free to ask those in the chat and we can filter those in as we come, but we'll be ending the session at 3:15. And I have actually another question I wanted to ask, sort of drawing on some of what has been shared here. I think we've talked a lot about the balance between the distributive side of climate justice as well as the structural side. And I'm curious now, in terms of the situation that we find ourselves in, the current reality, it's not like we haven't seen things like this before. So I'm curious, what can institutions do to make climate justice more durable when federal or state priorities shift in times like this or international context?
I mean, we haven't really addressed AI or data centers, which are kind of taking over the world in a very rapid way. So I might want to respond just to bring that into the conversation here. And because, I mean, I think it's my own sense, and I do work on understanding climate obstruction, like who are the powerful actors that have been blocking climate action and climate justice for decades. And the fossil fuel industry obviously is the one that comes up a lot. But right now, big tech and defense tech companies are collaborating with fossil fuel interests to promote AI and data centers. And AI, I think universities are getting used to promote AI, legitimize, and normalize that everyone should use AI for everything. The university that I was at before I left the United States was Northeastern University, and they've partnered with Anthropic, and everyone uses Claude for everything, and everyone's encouraged to use it for everything. And so I think universities are, I think the companies are very strategically focusing on universities, and we know that the Koch brothers before, in the 70s, acknowledged investing in universities is the way to kind of normalize the profit-seeking, fossil fuel extracting, economic growth mindset, right? And to make it at the mainstream. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that in, to acknowledge that our institutions are really structurally constrained, and they're also being strategically targeted to promote continued extraction and exploitation on a scale we have never seen. The AI stuff that's happening and the pace, it's not like anything's happened before. So I don't think we can say, that we can look back, and I mean, obviously we can learn from what different strategies that people have had to, and institutions have had to deal with before, but I think we're in a game-changing new reality, also with the concentration of wealth and power of these tech billionaires that seem to just be controlling so much of what's happening. So it's kind of scary times. Yeah.
I can jump in a little bit. Something that Kim and Olivia were speaking on resonated with me in terms of how we're engaging around our language and definitions of environmental justice. I'm reminded of like this Cornel West quote that is like, justice is what love looks like in public. Environmental justice is what we do in action in our public spaces, right? Justice isn't just like a thing, it's not durable in our institutions. This is defined also by our student success, our workforce development, our community engagement. So these things around like living off the umbrella term of environmental justice without the things, the pillars that hold this work up and focusing on that, I think is one of the ways we remain durable. Like the Pacific has survived thousands of years before these political systems came in because this work is embedded in our culture and our relationships and our responsibility to each other. So a lot of like where and I speak from a lot of privilege too. Like I'm in a blue state. We're in a school that's taking on this work, and the legacy of environmental and sustainability work has been here for a while. But we're also not, like Cami, you're mentioning, we're not separated from our institutions and our partners from other places. But our relationships still exist. Like, not to get too personal, Camish, we were together in DC when you got the news about your transition out of your institution. And that could, in most places, be like, well, that's the end of this. But your impact and your work at Second Nature and the community you built is everlasting. Like that's not leaving my impact and what I'm going to do going forward. And so relationships really hold on true to what's going to be important and how we sustain our work going forward. That a lot of our ability to build power is in our ability to organize ourselves and continue to find resources to kick into action. That's a very basic, like community org 101 definition of power. It's organized people with resources. And so as long as we can keep our relationship strong, I know the struggle to get resources to do the work is constant. But I think refocusing our time on that will at least keep us sustainable until our time comes again. Our political landscape shifts here or there, but we got to keep trucking.
Thank you, Mac. I would also say that I think the durability is going to come from, like Mac's saying, it's going to come from each player. So being able to transition to use different language, but still not hide what you're doing, to be able to find the optimism within yourself, to share that with students and to share that with the community, and to, like you said, to just keep trucking is kind of the theme that I heard from almost everyone that I was speaking to. The work's not going away and the need's not going away. And just how do I craft my language to continue to do what I want to do? And different places are having different amount of concerns. I was just speaking to someone yesterday. The Office of Management and Budget has a new document that's coming out, that's a new rule that's going to come out that may give the current administration even more leverage to claw back money. But though that is tragic and though that is sad, like we've said, as universities say, okay, I'm not going to depend on that so much. I think people are going to pull more into their communities and find within themselves that ability to stay optimistic and to keep getting the work done. And especially, I'm optimistic that it's especially going to be done probably more in their communities, maybe. But that is where the work needs to be done. And that's where the students will connect the most.
Go ahead, Luis.
So, how to make climate justice more durable? I think there is an assumption hidden in the question that we should make climate justice more durable. I would actually try to reframe it. The goal is not to make climate justice durable as an institutional agenda. The goal, I think, is to make justice durable by transforming the conditions that continuously reproduce injustice. So, too often, institutions respond to political shifts by asking how to preserve climate justice offices, programs, or the language. Those are important, but they are not the end goal. If justice depends solely on a particular administration or political moment, then we have institutionalized a program, not justice itself. So, to borrow from Achille Mbembe's concept of necropolitics, some political and institutional systems systematically expose certain people, territories, and ecosystems to greater harm, abandonment, or premature death. So if those systems remain intact, then the real question is not whether climate justice survives a political cycle, but whether injustice itself has become durable. So justice becomes durable not when institutions adopt the language of climate justice, but when they stop reproducing the conditions that make climate justice necessary. So for universities, I think this means embedding justice in how decisions are made rather than treating it as a separate initiative. It means making questions of power, exclusion, accountability, and structural inequality part of the governance, of budgeting, of research, of procurement, of curriculum and infrastructure decisions. It also means cultivating the capacity to ask difficult questions, even when they are politically uncomfortable. So ultimately, I think universities cannot eliminate structural injustice on their own, of course, but they can refuse to normalize it. They can make visible what often remains invisible, question the assumptions that sustain injustice, and educate professionals who recognize and challenge these dynamics rather than simply adapting to them.
Great insight. Thank you. And thank you all for actually taking the literal next question out of my mouth for the last 5 minutes there. We've covered a lot in the last 45 or so minutes. Time flies by when you're unpacking structural inequities and understanding how we can push this climate justice envelope forward collectively. I want to ask one final question, a little bit more of a gimme question, just as we find some parting thoughts for the road. And that's just simply this: looking ahead, what gives you hope about the future of climate justice work in higher education, right? Let's end on a positive note. And what do you think institutions need to protect most carefully in this next phase? So take that question as it is, enter in the context that you would like. There is no right answer, and anything that comes to mind is what we want to draw from you. So we'll start in the order that we introduced our panelists with. So Jenny will go you, and then we'll go to, I think it was Luis next, then Mac, then Cam, then Olivia.
Yeah, I would say the news that I've seen about students in commencements booing AI tech promoters who are giving commencement speeches. I think that gives me a lot of hope about young people and the resistance to AI and the direction the world's going. And so it's so inspiring to see. And I think the most important thing is protecting student freedom to speak, act, and resist and call things out. So thank you.
So it's difficult to have hope in the current environment, in the current context, geopolitical and otherwise. But what gives me hope is that climate justice has moved from the margins, I think, to the center of many institutional conversations. So questions that were once considered optional about equity, participation, indigenous knowledge, accountability, and even power are increasingly recognized as fundamental rather than additional. So at the same time, I think the next phase of climate justice requires us to resist becoming too comfortable with the conversation. Distributional questions about who benefits, who bears costs, how we achieve a just transition remain essential, but they are only part of the picture. If climate justice remains focused exclusively on downstream questions of distribution, we risk overlooking the upstream structures that continuously produce vulnerability, exclusion, and unequal exposure to harm. So what institutions, I think, need to protect most carefully is their willingness to keep asking the difficult questions about power, about exclusion, about responsibility, and the political institutional systems that shape climate futures, even when those questions become politically uncomfortable. Because once those questions disappear, climate action can continue, but climate justice often does not. So for me, universities have a particularly important role here. They should be places where difficult questions are not avoided because they are politically inconvenient, but pursued because they are intellectually necessary, as well as ethically critical to speak truth to power. That means asking not only how to distribute adaptation more fairly, but also how vulnerability is produced and so on, what I've spoken. So ultimately, what gives me hope is not the belief that we have reached a consensus on climate justice. It is the possibility that higher education continues to cultivate the courage to ask better questions. If we continue asking those questions, especially the uncomfortable ones, we keep open the possibility of imagining more just futures rather than simply managing increasingly unjust ones.
I think I've been higher ed almost 20 years and K-12 before that. You know, I still look young, still got it, right? Been here for a minute. What young people know now compared to when I first started doing this work is it's been really cool to see the progression, right? That we can go back into a K-5 school and then they're talking about these things. I mean, the goal is hopefully by the time they get into a certain age that they're ready to get turn on the action and ready to get their hands dirty and learn about what it's going to take to push these initiatives forward. But the other thing that filled me with hope was like 2 years ago, but I heard someone at a Second Nature conference and they're asking the room, like, what is it about what gives you hope? Sort of similar question. And a young man who just graduated was like, what gives me hope, you know, we've seen this for a while, is like those generations didn't have me. I'm here to go to work and I got what it takes. And I just sitting there like blown away, like, whoa, that kind of confidence that people are when they're embedded in the work and they're around communities who are in action, they're feeling empowered and energized to take on the next step. This thing isn't a race; it's a marathon, and I don't plan to be here forever. And when we see young people step up that way and take on the mantle and pass the baton and carry on the race, it fills me up with a lot of hope.
I'll say one of the interesting things that gives me hope is that, as Jenny has mentioned, you know, there's a lot of awareness about AI, and I know this sounds kind of interesting, but people have been discussing where their energy comes from. And that's something that in our space we think about all the time, but I've had many conversations with people about, well, wait a second, what do you mean that there could be a chances where people are having rolling blackouts or those sorts of things, or energy shortages? And all of those things lead back to asking some really big pivotal questions. So even though AI is this thing that we're uncomfortable with, and it's definitely the energy and the water, all of those, that opens people up to understand and ask questions, and to ask where's their power coming from, and who controls that power, and because power is such a pivotal thing in our life, and very few people sit around and talk about how their lights get turned on or those sorts of things for their community. And so I think even though we're in a time where we're seeing a lot of things we're not happy with, it's making people ask questions. And as Mac just said, young people are asking those questions, and then they're wanting to make a change, and they're wanting to learn more. And I think that is a durability for sustainability that people want to know and want to move forward.
Yep, I will just, without repeating what people have said, maybe just build on that and just say, I feel right now, again, I feel lucky about this, but that we are almost busier than we have ever been in ways, I think, because of this interest from students and this interest from community members and people just wanting to do something and feeling, maybe at a loss, but feeling like they want to do something. So that's what gives me hope is that people are doing work. I just see it, I see it every day. Woo, gonna get a little emotional, but I feel people are doing the work, and that is what gives me hope. I think that's what we have to do, and I am hesitant to put all of my hope into the institutions. I worry that our institutions are going to become, I mean, they already are becoming businesses, and so I think we have to really think about how we can sort of step up and step out and help people do the change in the work that they want to see happen. So seeing people really want to step up and do that gives me hope.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists for such a thoughtful conversation. I mean, my notepad over here is just chock full right now with great insight that you all have shared over the last hour. And I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to share this conversation in space with you all. A few key themes set out for me, obviously, around the idea of treating climate justice as a core institutional work, not just an add-on to sustainability, right? We dug really, really deep here, all the way from that to the importance of building relationships, not just between faculty, but with actual communities, drawing on the expertise from those who are outside of traditional power structures, the importance that students can have in this equation, empowering the strength and energy of our young people, and the importance of capacity, not just for the money, not just for the staff or institutions that we're at, but what it actually means to have a capacity to affect change. And finally, just reminding us in this conversation that climate justice isn't about just responding to harm. It's about building better systems to address the causes of those harms, focusing on the conditions that reproduce injustice and not just those downstream impacts. So thank you again to Jenny, Luis, Olivia, Mac, and Kem for joining us today. And I will now turn it back to Stephen.
Thank you, Theo, and thank you all of the panelists for a terrific, rich conversation. I'm sure that everyone enjoyed it. Please know that we will have a recording of this available on our website so you can watch it or you can share it with others who want to hear this webinar as well. ACE and Second Nature will be continuing our partnership, so keep your eyes peeled for additional elements of that and additional projects that we'll be working on together. One project that we are already working on in light of the challenges here in Washington, D.C. related to advancing climate policy work that we touched on a little bit today. Later this year, we plan to release a state sustainability toolkit for campus stakeholders to advocate, if they'd like, in their states for tangible ways to expand sustainability efforts through state higher ed partnerships. So that's one concrete way we're going to be continuing our partnership, and I'm sure we'll be thinking of others. Thank you again for joining us today, and we wish all of you a very good day. Take care.